Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here. And Maya, I have to say, I'm such a big fan and had such a good time listening to you. And I love the fact that you talked about profound humility being required when we talk about large change, because I often say that compassion is the first and foremost principle that we need to hold in change. Change is very hard, it's very dynamic, it's very complex, and compassion for the human spirit and human nature is obviously a profound need and change. So I obviously here am here to talk to you guys about behavior change as it relates to strategy. And for the last decade, I've had the pleasure of spending my days helping organizations create and execute on strategy that is both inspired and, of course, informed by behavioral science. And to put very simply, I do fundamentally see on the day to day and in the ground of working with my clients that behavioral science allows us to disentangle some of the assumptions that we have about behavior change and intentions that erode our ability to deliver the value of a good strategy. And really, there is no strategy that is more susceptible to value erosion than that of transformation. And so it is primarily due to the fact that changing risks are occurring for businesses today. Organizations are making bigger bets, arguably bets that are so big and so ambitious that they are truly worthy of the moonshot nomenclature to try and compete with a very fast moving competitive landscape and higher expectations of the role in business in society today. And these risks are very real, they're very tangible, and they're grounded in assumptions that underlie our estimations of value generation. I think Maya was talking about this fact that we are fundamentally bad at forecasting. This is very much true, but when you are developing strategy, when you are calculating the potential impact and the value of making those big bets, those forecasts are required. And so how can we make those forecasts in a way that align with our business, are most likely to actually generate the value that we're looking for and help curb some of that true erosion? Now, if there's one thing that we do fundamentally understand, it's that risks tend to rise and fall with the ebb and flow of transformation. And for this reason, it's less about preparing for every single detail, but actually having the right tools to be able to navigate the complexities of the unknown. And let's be serious, transformations obviously carry a lot of unknowns. And this is because we know that the transformation path is very non-linear. So here we've got something where we would project sort of a linear plan of value creation. It often tends to erode at very particular moments. And so what does that terrain actually look like? How do we plan for it? I think there are two primary essentials that you need when you're navigating strategy of transformation. One is that you pack your bag wisely, ensure that you've got everything that you need to help handle the trip in stride and actually navigate the terrain. And the second is that you know your pivot plan. And I think the pivot plan is such a key concept of transformations that we don't talk about enough. We don't plan for enough, and that's something that I think is truly an essential when you are preparing for this journey. So, what does a transformation journey sort of actually look like? Obviously, good strategy charts a journey with a very clear North Star, a suite of parameters that indicate success. You've got assumptions that are cataloged. You've got accountabilities that are defined. Everybody around the table ideally is on the same page. You've got your big bet plan crafted and everybody is ready to go. And now, inevitably, what ends up happening is that life is obviously not very clear cut. We all know this, we understand it, we experience it in our day to day. And at some point, the world will actually change enough that your preparation has run its course. Now, the core elements might still be true, but you find that the car is a little bit rocky, the nuts and bolts are a little bit loose, and that's just because the organic nature of the world that we live in means that there will be complexities that we will not account for. And this is often when you need to pivot. And the truth is, you're not just going to have to pivot once, you're going to have to pivot a number of times. And perhaps one of the most beautiful things about transformation is that once you reach your end goal, once you reach the top of that peak, you've generated your value, you've achieved your North Star, you actually realize that it's just one step in a much bigger journey. And that really your ability to navigate that next step in the journey is the ability to catalog and really learn from your previous experience in order to take you further into the future. And I think this is why, transformations and this understanding of a very bumpy terrain is not new. Obviously, the transformation how to is vast and varied. The notion of a bumpy and rocky ride is not novel, and there are hundreds and hundreds of articles out there in terms of why transformations fail, why you need to pivot, why value erosion occurs, and how to navigate them successfully. And this has led to a proliferation of root causes where patterns do exist, but I think the nuances are plenty for organizations. I think Maya talked on that very well in the previous session, this notion of complexities being true and nuances being important. And organizations need to determine which of those risk factors are relevant for their journey and how to best tackle them. And there are so many here that it sometimes can be very overwhelming. And I do think that's one of the reasons why transformations are difficult from the get-go. But as it relates to behavioral science, there are true root causes where behavioral science plays a critical role, where the miscalibration of behavioral change assumptions that underlie our strategy play a more dominant role than others. One of those is the inability to actually drive sustained change. And I have a sneaky feeling that everybody around the table at Nudgestock talks about this a lot in their day to day. And the second is really about having that foundational framework in order to drive pivots. And so, this is where the simple translation from business to behavioral terminology is incredibly illuminating and actually the first step of behavioral strategy, which is taking a strategic pain point, an issue, a problem that is solved that is going to drive your North Star strategy and translating it into a core behavioral problem. So, for example, if we take the inability to drive sustained change, really this is about not having a behavior change model at the core of decision making. When we talk about a lack of a foundational framework in order to drive pivots, really this is about not having a behavior change model that is at the core of measurement and tracking. And when we break these down into sort of our essentials in terms of how to navigate complex change and transformations, this is where it very much is about having the foundational frameworks in order to drive your pivots and obviously the behavioral models to drive the sustained change. That means building a behavioral model into the way that the problem is defined, the way that the assumptions are quantified, and how that execution plan is actually crafted. And it's about building a behavioral model into the way that data is tracked and measured with generated insights tactically guiding the optimizations for those pivots. So this all sounds very good in high level 10,000 foot ideation. Obviously, putting it into practice and understanding the core steps around how this works is where the rubber really meets the road. And so what I want to spend my last couple minutes with you guys on is how do you actually break down a really meaty strategy with these behavioral foundations to guide your way through transformations and pivots. The very first piece, which I talked about earlier, is the translation of that strategy. So here, as an example, the business strategy is to improve proactive customer engagement by leveraging new tools that help employees manage their time and interactions with customers. That very first translation is to a behavioral strategy of driving employee adoption of customer relationship management tool. Seems very simple, but even that first piece of just redefining the strategy around the behavior that you are trying to encourage has such a powerful way of opening up our flexibility to understand the potential assumptions at play and craft our plan for how to actually navigate. The next step is to then bring the behavioral model into play. That behavioral model here, I'm talking about the openness to change model. It's well documented, specifically in terms of those 4 predictive factors that actually drive marginal utility in change of employee behavior and adoption of new ways of working. Those 4 factors are that the program and the change in the new world has to drive a positive experience, has to drive immediate value, has to be easy to integrate into their day-to-day lives, and it has to actually create structure and routine. So this is the model that is going to underpin and allow us to drive that behavioral strategy. Now, every model is not going to be perfect This one is derived from the ivory tower. But on the day to day, when you are working with your clients, when you're working with your own organization, it's about fine tuning, calibrating, and validating those model factors to align with the real experience of your employees on the day to day. But it's really important to understand that the academics have done a lot of heavy lifting here. They've done a really good job triangulating and understanding what those variables are. And our job is to bring that at the foundation of the assumptions that are driving our work. The next stage, of course, is to actually define what we call the vectors of value. So it's breaking it down into two predominant vectors. Here you've got positive experience and immediate value being your the value through real-time impact value vector. The second is the ease of integration and creating structure, creating your value through real-time ease vector. And you guys might be saying, why on earth do you need two vectors? And I promise I will get to that for you guys. But this foundationally lies your what we call your strategic blueprint. And your strategic blueprint is your overarching strategy that's going to calibrate your assumptions. So we've got the vectors of value that are your higher order values that sit at the core of your mission and vision for change. You've got your guiding principles, which are the core factors that are derived from the behavioral model that you have chosen to solve the behavioral problem at the core of your strategy. These are really the principles that are driving your day-to-day strategy execution and design decisions. That then allows you to fundamentally create your experience architecture. And a lot of change programs. This is, yes, of course, change management, but it's the broader features and functionalities that are actually created to drive the new way. So here, for example, you've got positive experience. You build the new way to reduce friction and personalize the experience. To drive immediate value, you are building the new way to provide action-based feedback and create perceptions of value and reciprocity. For ease of integration, it's about aligning the new way with the old way through triggers and cues and existing structures at play. Or for creating structure, this is about building the new way to create more opportunity for routine and repetition. This is your strategic blueprint. This is what's going to guide all of your foundational elements that is going to launch you on that journey. The next key piece is how do you actually then derive your pivot playbook? How do you then know what to do when things are not going as planned? And it's about rerouting or regrounding yourself in those foundational variables. So the first piece you need to do is identify the data, the core data feeds and sources that will allow you to track and measure how each of your features and functionalities within your transformation program are feeding into those four factors of positive experience, value, integration, and structure. You then, of course, have to take those actual data feeds and transpose into your two vectors of value. Again, I promised why I would say that you need to identify those two factors as opposed to leaving it open to four. And that's foundationally so that you can optimize using a 2x2 optimization playbook. Of course, I'm a strategy consultant. I'm born and raised after my PhD of being a core consultant. I love a good 2x2 because I think it helps simplify the problem in a way that is meaningful. And when it comes to behavior change, it's a great way to allow for optimization. This effectively allows you to plot the data of the discrete program features that are driving your new way and gives you a very real way to know how you need to optimize. For those features and functionalities that are in your top right-hand quadrant, you know that you can leverage those through experience bundling or reclassification to actually move the needle on the other programs and features that are not being sort of adopted primarily in the way that you would expect. Your features and functionalities that sit in the top left-hand quadrant, you know you need to optimize them for ease. There's too much friction, there's too much barriers or too many barriers in the way. On the bottom right-hand quadrant, you're going to actually optimize for impact. They need to have more positive reinforcement. There needs to be immediate value, either through tangible or intangible means. And the quadrant that is perhaps the most important in pivoting and transformations are those that fall in the bottom left-hand quadrant. When you are sitting around a boardroom and you are trying to decide really tough decisions on how you are going to move forward in a transformation, where to automate, what features you need to actually give up on. You know, those sunk costs are so hard to navigate. This gives you an evidence-based and true framework for being able to have that conversation that is rooted in the expectation of change. basically features and functionalities that sit in that bottom left-hand quadrant are going to be very hard to change or very expensive to do so. So we have to down-regulate our reliance on the human and think more about how we can optimize in alternative ways for those features and functionalities. What's great about that is you can then take those optimization efforts, you pack them in your bag, you redefine the way that you're thinking about some of your assumptions, you're tightening the calibration to both your understanding of your employees and your organization, but of course the terrain that you are navigating as well. And perhaps most importantly, also then going back to your guiding principles, going back to your strategic blueprint and fine tuning it to the way that your organization operates for when you finish this transformation and move on to that next piece, that bigger, that meatier, that enterprise-wide transformation that's helping you navigate change. So I'm hoping today that I've sort of convinced you guys that behavioral science can sit at the core of strategy. There's foundational ways to do it. It's just about us actually making sure that we're taking that business strategy, redefining it in terms of the behavioral assumptions that underlie our assumptions of estimated value, and then really tethering to those frameworks, both in our guiding principles and our strategic blueprint, but of course in the way that we design our pivot playbooks through optimization tools. And I think I am exactly at time, which is a little bit wild. I don't know how that actually happened, but open any conversation. I think Rory is supposed to have a couple minutes here.
Yeah. That's fantastic. It's wonderful to see you again, by the way.
Hi, Rory.
There's probably nothing other than change management which promises so much but so frequently fails to deliver. And would you say to a large extent that's because it's effectively done with a structural neatness first, psychology last approach?
You're really putting me on the spot there, and I hope none of my colleagues are joining, Rory.
Of course, I was going to say.
I think, change management in its traditional frameworks is exactly as you say. It takes a very process, people, technology sort of framework first. What the evolution of change management looks like, I think, is exactly what I shared today, which is what are those core foundational principles that will allow us to drive change in a more systemic fashion. But I do very much see it as an evolution of the pre-existing change management functions. To sort of give my change management friends, a bit of a flower, if you will, is that they are also not often brought into transformations in an effective way. They are often an afterthought and brought in at the end of transformations. If they were brought in at the right time and brought in from the very beginning when strategic conversations were happening, I think overall they would be more successful.
Do you think perhaps, presumably this approach can also work for things like mergers as well, is that right? You'd see that as absolutely part of the same category.
Absolutely. And we've tried and tested that with a number of organizations. Primarily, this is around identifying those vectors of value that are true to the nuances of the two organizations that are merging together, right? There are great foundational behavioral models that help us understand integrations of different populations and different, teams or groups. And so identifying what those two vectors of value are and identifying where in that true integration plan you are accounting for those variety of factors is critical. And we've seen great success with that.
Do you think there's a wider philosophical question at work here? So your fellow Canadian, who you probably know, Roger L. Martin, who I was introduced to by actually both Dilip Soman and also by the B2B Institute at LinkedIn. He writes quite a lot in his new book, A New Way to Think, that the narrative, probably driven by the shareholder value movement, the narrative now tends to see value as something that's created organizationally at head office, whereas his preferred reframing is that value is actually created on the supermarket shelf, or it's created in the interface between the company and its customers. And that probably things like the shareholder value movement, probably inventions like the spreadsheet, have actually caused us to prioritize what you might call organizational and operational neatness, as seen from the top, crucially, over the real business of value, which actually happens at where the tires touch the tarmac. actually in the marketplace. And
Hmm.
there's an interesting question. There's a wonderful book by an anarchist writer called James C. Scott, which is called Seeing Like a State. And his argument is that lots of schemes fail because the design of the scheme has to make sense to the people at the top, and the compromises they make in order to achieve legibility and comprehension lead to solutions being delivered to the bottom which are completely misaligned with the interests of the people they're often designed to serve, in fact. Do you think there's actually a kind of, that actually in a sense, the top-down approach to change management, particularly when it's principally designed around what you might call the organogram, is problematic in
Hmm.
itself? Do you think that, or do you think this system can actually overcome that? I'd be really impressed if it can, because I'd be delighted.
I think, oh, Rory, I love your question so much. I this is the nut that we're trying to crack, and these are the
Yeah,
conversations that we have every day. And foundationally, it's because those who are at the top of the organizations are making the decisions. There's a lot on the line, and naturally, we know we have an aversion to ambiguity. We don't necessarily like uncertainty, especially when the risks are very
yeah.
high, and so we manufacture neatness, and we know that neatness does not occur, and foundationally that's what creates that really rocky path of transformations that I showed visually earlier. I think actually, being able to have foundational behavioral frameworks when you are having those conversations and calibrating those assumptions actually helps create more realistic expectations at the most senior level. What tends to happen is that we have this understanding that the general employee base and our forecasting of the future is based on the intention of an individual, what people think is best, what people think other people will do, what people say they will do in the future. Everybody around this table at Nudgestock knows there's a very large gap between our intentions and our actual behavior. I fundamentally believe the value of behavioral science is in the ability to understand and calibrate and know when those gaps are open and how to close them. But I think the problem that this creates at the senior leader level is that we have an expectation reality gap. So whereas in behavioral science, we talk about the intention action gap at the ground
Yes,
level, the person level, at the organizational level, it creates an expectation reality gap. And what I'm
because
seeing in organizations that are more mature is they are open to understanding what that gap is and how frameworks like I talked about today can calibrate and better close those assumptions.
yeah, I've heard some very interesting work from Shopify, for example, where they've taken a very, very interesting approach. For example, they're less keen on this. They're happy to have smaller teams, which means slightly greater people in middle management, because they just find anthropologically that works better. The other thing that always interests me is I think the need for neatness tends to remove too much autonomy in the interest of
Mm.
neatness, because everybody's role becomes more and more tightly defined. And of course, autonomy is partly a source of status, but it's also a huge source of employee reward. And the extent to
Mhm.
which actually you are allowed to make discretionary decisions or use your own judgment is a great part of what makes work enjoyable. And of course, seen from the top, it's what makes work messy. And so I
Mhm.
think, I mean, the interesting question is, I suppose, your bottom left quadrant, isn't it? You can optimize fairly successfully. And the bottom left quadrant is where you simply say, actually, this isn't working. We have to go back and rethink, which I think is really, really interesting. So you'd see the process as
Yeah,
kind of iterative in a sense. Yeah.
it is. And, large scale organizations are trying very hard to move towards more agile operating models. They are trying to reward failure. They are trying to create metrics of success that were not on the performance scorecards of employees 5, 10 years ago, where it is around these messy elements that do generate long term value for the organization, shifting some of their value generation models to try and demonstrate more quick wins that are true indicating or leading indicators of that long term success to try and create some of that neatness within a messier structure. I think it's really challenging to do when you are beholden to shareholders, sort of to loop us
Yeah.
back to your original commentary. Value generation is very difficult to do when you are making mistakes.
Yes.
Um,
Perfect.
especially in a quarterly
Yeah.
environment. It really strangles a lot of organizations, but I get the joy of seeing really big organizations around the world try and tackle this. And I am happy to say that in the 10 years that I've been consulting, we are at a really exciting space. And I think that's partially because our eyes are open to some of this. And I think stakeholder management and stakeholder value is more valuable now than it was before. We have made that shift from shareholder to stakeholder value in terms of generation, and that is putting a lot of pressures on business to change the way that they operate.
Absolutely, that was absolutely fantastic. Well, all I can say is more success to you, because anything that sensibly acknowledges these factors in going forward, it can only be an improvement. So more success to you, and hope to see you later in the year in Toronto. It'd be an absolute joy.
I
Melaina,
hope
thank you
so.
very much indeed. That's absolutely fantastic.
Thank you for having me.
What a
Have a
pleasure.
lovely
Thank
day.
you. You too. Just one favour. If you want to keep Nudgestock free, click the like button because the algorithm likes it, and click the subscribe button too. The algorithm likes that, and unlike the like button, it's actually useful because you'll get notified of future content from Nudgestock whenever it becomes available.